jure and de facto segregation. Jump Jim Crow was an old song and dance routine that originated in 1828, which was written by a white comedian by the name of T.D. Daddy Rice, who would perform in blackface, basically to make fun of slaves.
Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow.
The term Jim itself is short for Jimmy, like I'm going to jimmy a lock, and that was a crowbar. So a crowbar in the 1800s was sometimes called a Jim or a Jimmy. And then, of course, crow itself was used as a term for blacks as early as the 1700s. In terms of jump Jim Crow, farmers used to feed their crows corn-soaked whiskey. Then the crows would get drunk and kind of dance around, not being able to fly as the farmers beat the crows to death. So there's multiple meanings behind the term Jim Crow. They all refer in a negative connotation to slaves and to freedmen, to blacks. And now we're going to turn that term Jim Crow into a system of racial oppression. We'll have federal Jim Crow, federal segregation, and we're going to put the blame squarely on maybe one of the most racist presidents, a Democrat by the name of Woodrow Wilson. Even though Woodrow Wilson was the head of Princeton in New Jersey, and people tend to think of him as a progressive, he may have been a progressive in some respects, but he was born down in Virginia, before the Civil War. So he's the first Southerner to be elected to the presidency of the United States since the Civil War. And one of his first things that he's going to do, he's going to segregate the federal workplace. He's going to segregate the Army. In fact, if you were applying for a position in the Wilson administration, you had to send a photo just to make sure you were of the right, skin color. So Wilson and the Democrats are just as guilty as the Democrats in the South on a state and local level of kind of making this happen. So we've talked a little bit about, Jim Crow in terms of segregation de jure and a little bit of segregation de facto. There's lots more that we could talk about. And of course, the enforcement of at least segregation de facto and I guess segregation de jure is happening through the use of terrorist organizations like the KKK, which are widespread throughout the early 20th century, which are going to use intimidation, humiliation, and violence to make sure that African Americans are put in their place, that they're not fighting back. But why don't we start talking about kind of the slow road to the end of this, century Jim Crow system of racial oppression. So we're going to get to the good stuff in a moment. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the civil rights movement as most people understand it in terms of Martin Luther King and Montgomery and Selma and all of the laws that are passed. But one of the earlier origins of the fight against Jim Crow and segregation occurs on the federal level. And there was an incident in 1946 called the blinding of Isaac Woodward Jr., where a member of the armed services, an African-American, Isaac Woodward, who had just been honorably discharged, literally a few hours later, had an incident with the sheriff department where he was beaten to a bloody pulp, where he was basically blinded. And that caught the attention of the nation. And there were popular songs written about it. Woody Guthrie, one of my favorite musical peeps, wrote a song called The Blinding of Isaac Woodward. This caught the attention of the Truman administration, who forcefully went after the guys who did this, one of the sheriffs in the sheriff's department, the local police. They were then tried in a federal court in South Carolina.
Now, we must know that in reality, you have races coming together, trying to help one another, but this is not what the media is portraying. The media wants to continue a divide and conquer, and all this is done through duality to bring forth a new world order. So we're gonna go ahead and get into this Chronicles. Welcome to This is America, Destruction of the Black Community Chronicles.
this video, I want to talk about the system of Jim Crow segregation, which was common in the United States from about 1877 to approximately 1954, although it goes a little bit farther than that. Now, you're probably familiar with some of the aspects of Jim Crow segregation from the Civil Rights Movement. Jim Crow segregation involved the loss of voting rights for African Americans, as well as separate public accommodations. And by public accommodations, I mean all sorts of public spaces in American life. So this might be transportation, separate areas and trains and buses, or hotels, bathrooms, swimming pools, water fountains. So these places in public life where African Americans were put in the place of a second-class citizenship, where they could not experience the full range of movement, job benefits, protection of the law, or really any of the aspects of American citizenship that are the benefits that come with paying taxes and abiding by the law. And during this period of Jim Crow, this kind of segregation was legal. This was not just in practice, but encoded in the law. So where did this system of Jim Crow come from? Well, let's start with the name Jim Crow. Jim Crow was not the name of a specific person. Actually, Jim Crow was the name of a stock character. A stock character is kind of a basic, well-known character in usually a comedy. And we still have stock characters in comedy today in lots of different forms of entertainment. Think of the absent-minded professor, or more recently, the manic pixie dream girl. You know, the girl who's going to change her whole life by being so off the wall. Well, Jim Crow was one of these characters in a form of entertainment called the minstrel show. And the minstrel show was a very popular kind of vaudeville type live performance. The minstrel show was actually very popular in the north of the United States, places like New York City, in the 1830s, 1840s, kind of this antebellum period before the Civil War. So this character of Jim Crow was supposed to be kind of the stupid slave who lived on the plantation. And this character of Jim Crow was almost always played by a white man wearing black makeup on his face. So it was not an actual African American person, but rather a caricature of an African American person by a white man who was part of a minstrel troupe. And so the name Jim Crow became kind of synonymous with African Americans and with enslaved people in the early 19th century, the way that, say, Paddy became synonymous with an Irish person. So the term Jim Crow law, or the Jim Crow system, means laws that were specifically aimed at African Americans. All right, so that's the origin of the name. But where did the system come from? And for that, we're going to have to do a fairly deep dive into American history. And I won't be able to go into everything here, but let's kind of look at this from the 1,000-foot view and get a sense of the overall pattern of slavery, the Civil War, and race relations after the Civil War to see where Jim Crow starts. Now, I've been daring here and done a vertical timeline. The first thing we have on here is the end of the Civil War. Now, before the Civil War, in the southern part of the United States, which I have outlined in red here, most of these states had legal slavery. And in these states, or the colonies that preceded them, starting about 1620, they imported African slaves to be unfree laborers on cash crop plantations. And these might include tobacco or cotton And that system of slavery persisted until the balance of power between the North, where slavery was largely illegal, and the South, where slavery was the backbone of the economic and political system. Eventually, it tore the country apart into the Civil War. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, saying that all enslaved people in the states which were currently in rebellion were now free. But it wasn't until the end of the Civil War that slavery's end was official everywhere in the United States. And the end of slavery really posed a problem for the states of the South. Now, obviously, this was a wonderful thing for people who had been enslaved. Now they had full freedom to move and work and marry whomever they pleased, at least in theory. But it also meant that the system of slavery, which had dominated the politics, the economics, the social system of the South for more than 200 years, was now over, and something had to replace it. So in the immediate period after the Civil War, the question is, what are race relations going to look like in the South? How will whites and blacks relate to each other without the system of slavery, which has dominated the entire region for more than 200 years?